I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you that this show currently has no advertisers or sponsors. It is entirely listener funded, which is why I need your support at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. It will help to keep this show going and growing if you can make a monthly donation to my Patreon page. Now, with that out of the way, we have a very interesting story we're going to be covering on this edition of the show. Recently, I came across an article at the New Arab entitled "Leaked Documents Suggest Secret Dealings Between Assad Regime and Israel." Very interesting story. It's important to note these documents have not been verified yet, but there is an argument to be made that they are authentic, or if they're not authentic, they're a very elaborate hoax. We'll get into why it's either one of those two possibilities in the conversation to follow with journalist Patrick Hilsman. After doing a little bit of digging into this story, I found Hilsman, who is an editor at Turning Point magazine, and he's been looking into this story. He's also covered the connections, the relationship between Russia and Israel, specifically the way in which Israeli drones have been purchased by Russia over the years and then used in places like Syria. It's a story that doesn't necessarily get covered that much because, well, it's inconvenient to multiple different parties, politically speaking. We're going to be talking about that as well as these leaked documents and much, much more in the conversation to follow. So without any further ado, let's get right to it with Patrick Hilsman. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to have on the show. He was recommended to me by another journalist, and I'm very happy to be speaking with him. Journalist Patrick Hilsman has worked at Al Jazeera, the Intercept, and a number of other publications. I believe he's also contributed to Turning Point magazine. Is there anything I'm leaving out, and how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm an editor at Turning Point magazine, and I also did a film for PBS 2 years ago and various other projects. But yeah, you introduced me great.
So the first thing I want to get into is the reason I initially contacted you, and that's these reports that are coming out of leaked documents involving Syria and Israel, and potentially collaboration between the Assad regime and Israel. It's important we note these documents haven't been verified yet. But I think you'll fill us in on what this is all about.
Yes. So there's actually, as of now, no way to know whether or not those documents are real. But one thing that we can establish is that they were definitely written by somebody that was knowledgeable about the system that Israel and Russia had set up to allow Israeli strikes in Syria. So throughout the history of the Syrian civil war, Hezbollah obviously was involved on the side of the Assad regime, and it's been pretty conspicuous that Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in that time and was very successful at basically winding down Hezbollah. And that naturally raises the question, where was Syrian air defense? And where was Russian air defense? And in 2018, I wrote an article about what's called the deconfliction mechanism, which is a system that Russia set up when they intervened to support the Assad regime. And basically, what the system does is that the Israelis contact Russia, and then Russia tells their air defense system to stand down. And then it allows the Israelis to bomb inside of Syria. It's one of the least best kept secrets in the Middle East. It's very widely known, and it's been accepted. And the reason that we know about it is actually that both the Israeli and Russian side talked openly about it. So that's how we know of that deconfliction mechanism. But those documents that were leaked are either actually notes from the deconfliction mechanism being sent to the Syrian regime, or they are an incredibly elaborate fake made by somebody that very deeply understands the deconfliction mechanism.
So, what do we know about these documents? I'm going to have to pull up the piece I read in the New Arab about it. But I mean, I guess even though they haven't been verified yet, what do they actually say?
So basically, what they are is they gravitate between warnings of saying, "Hey, don't allow Hezbollah to fire from such and such location," or they also involve specific warnings about individuals saying such and such commander is operating from this area. Please interdict. And in one specific incident that we're looking into, it looks as though there was a request to divert aircraft carrying Iranian arms that the Syrian regime and Russia basically agreed to. And from what we understand, there were certain cases like that where aircraft were diverted and then their contents were bombed afterwards.
So the response I've seen is, well, these documents haven't been verified yet, and people will say, well, why would Syria in any way collaborate with Israel, being that Syria is part of the vaunted axis of resistance, or Assad's Syria was. Now, I have issues with that term axis of resistance because I think some people treat it like it's the, NATO of the Middle East, like the NATO of Iran or whatever. And I don't really think that's what it is or was. But maybe you could talk a little bit about why you think these documents may have some weight to them.
Well, if you were the people that want to make the axis of resistance like comparison to the NATO of Iran, a good way to sort of debunk that concept is imagine if NATO was getting messages from like Russia saying, "Hey, we're going to bomb the Ukrainian embassy. Please move your guards away from the Ukrainian embassy." Like that wouldn't be considered a real alliance. That would be considered sort of like I don't know, like putting on an image of an alliance. And I think with Iran, Syria, and they consider the Ansar Islam movement, the Houthis in Yemen, to also be part of their axis of resistance. With those groups, it's very conspicuous that a lot of them have been sent to go fight in Syria for Assad, but that ultimately Hezbollah's strategy against Israel was very weak. Like you didn't see them engage Israel from Syria. You didn't see them do a very large. They didn't conduct very large operations against Israel. And if you look at some of the cities that Hezbollah fought in Syria, like Yarmouk, which is a Palestinian camp, it's completely destroyed. And they helped besiege it. They helped starve people there. Whereas their operations against Israel since October 7th and since the genocide have been absolutely limited. And just like to a point where it's very conspicuous in the Middle East that they didn't have much of a plan and didn't put up much of a fight.
With this deconfliction mechanism, can you speak more to that? And also, I mean, I think this relationship between Israel and Russia is very well documented, but oddly, I think it's not always spoken about enough.
Definitely. What's really weird is that it's not like it's the most secret thing in the world. Another example that I've written about for quite some time now is the fact that the Russian drone program that's been modernized in recent years essentially has its origins in technology transfer with Israel. So I'm gonna have to rewind the clock a bit. Uh, well, as we all know, the Soviet Union was one of the first countries to recognize Israel, and I believe it was the first country to provide them with an air force. So a lot of Israel's first aircraft that they used were captured German and I think Czech aircraft that were provided to the Israelis by the Soviet Union. At the time, Stalin thought that it would be a socialist project. He thought that it was in line with communism, so he supported them. Later in his life, he became an extreme, I mean, he was always an anti-Semite, let's be real, but he became like an extreme paranoid anti-Semite. And so he was paranoid that there were Jewish plots against him. His thinking in his last days was really very insane, and not necessarily as a result. He cut support for Israel not because of the massacres that were happening or because of the terrible things that the Israeli government had done during the Nakba, but because he personally felt that like Jews were out to get him or something. It's a very strange historical thing. And so for decades and decades, the Soviet Union really did not like to import weapons. And it was very rare that the Soviets would ever import a weapon unless it was from specifically a Soviet satellite state. And of course, in World War II, they used a lot of American weapons. But so we'll fast forward again to 2008 when Vladimir Putin launched the invasion of South Ossetia in Georgia. And during that invasion, the Russian Air Force lost more aircraft than they expected, and they were less effective at suppressing Georgian air defense. So as a result of that, they realized that they had a major gap with the West because a lot of Western countries have these very advanced drone programs. Even America's old stuff and Israel's old stuff was just light years ahead of Russia's program at the time. So in a really strange geopolitical move, the Russians reached out to the Israelis to help them update their drone program. And as a result, starting in, I think, 2008, no, I think it was 2009 or 2010, they started exporting the IAI Searcher 2, which is an Israeli drone. I think it has its origins in the 70s and 80s. And they started exporting it to Russia. And then Russia got a manufacturing license, which means that Russia now produces IAI Searcher 2s in Russia under the name Forepost. So Russia currently, today, has factories building Israeli licensed drones, which is a fact that is very often ignored when people talk about like the grand chessboard of geopolitics. But they're very much in cahoots in that sense.
I think that's very important to note because I've noticed when talking about, you mentioned the grand chessboard of geopolitics. I think there's people that look at Israel and say, well, Israel is a U.S. ally. It can do no wrong. I'm not going to look at anything critical about it.
Mm.
And then, I think that ignores the ways in which Israel has worked with, you know, adversaries of the U.S. So
Yes,
maybe
very
we
much
could
so.
talk a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, because the problem is that a lot of the time getting into this subject, it's like a lot of subjects. It's like, for example, I think George Soros is an interesting guy, right? I think there's a lot of people are very paranoid about him and have stupid ideas. So it's very hard to have any kind of conversation about something that people have a pre-constructed conspiracy theory about without it deteriorating into like stupidity or racism and whatnot. So I do think that there's kind of an anti-Semitic trope attached with, oh, Israel is working with our enemies, you know. But the fact is that it's a government that represents policy, and governments often are hypocrites. And Israel is no different. And especially when it's a government that's capable of inflicting genocide on people, it should hardly be surprising that they aren't super great to their allies. So, in terms of examples of the Israelis working against U.S. interests, I mean, obviously, we talk about the USS Liberty. It's the case when there was an American ship that was sank by the Israelis. I don't really think it's definitive as to whether or not it was by accident or on purpose, certainly callous. And there's certainly a long history of the Israelis also engaging with the Soviet Union. It's strongly the author Gordon Thomas, I believe, posited that the
Gideon
Israelis.
Spies, I believe, was his book. Yeah.
Correct. Okay, great. Yeah, you've done your reading. I believe that he posited, I could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it's believed that the Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard in the 1980s provided the Soviets with a significant amount of data on American submarines. Uh, Again, that's what's been reported. I've never seen a document that proves that. I've never seen it. I've never seen personally seen evidence for that, but credible sources have reported that that's what happened. And it's not surprising because again, uh, a large number of Israelis are of Russian origin. A lot of the time, if you call a number in Israel, it'll say press 2 for Russian. It's the cultural ties are obvious. And also, if you'll see some of Netanyahu's reelection posters, I think in 2019 or 2018, had gigantic photos of him with Vladimir Putin. So it's not. People would be surprised by how close this relationship is.
I was going to say, I think there's also that issue where, and I don't think this isn't necessarily really educated people doing this, but I think people try to oversimplify uh, geopolitics, especially in the Middle East, to where, well, Iran is aligned with Russia. Therefore, you know, Israel is always the good guy or always doing the right thing, even though it's led by, uh, the far right wing, coalition that
Yeah.
Netanyahu has put together. And I think that has led to a lot of problems in people's analysis. There's this idea that if you're criticizing Israel, then you're letting Iran off the hook. And I wanted you to point out that this is kind of
Yeah, it's bullshit.
harebrained. Yeah.
It's complete bullshit because it's like neither of these countries is constructing like a bright future that can be inspiring to anyone. I mean, like they're corrupt ethnostates, and and that's a terrible model for the future. And yeah, sure, they hate each other, but like it's not a coincidence that like I have this thing where when it comes to people talking about Israel's role in the region is that let's be real. The real problem with Israel is that they're oppressing Palestinians. Like that's what the problem is. The other stuff, a lot of it's bullshit. Like I don't really think that Iran and Israel can easily coexist on the planet. It's rhetoric. There's no reason for them to have to fight a big war with each other, especially using proxies that are like massacring civilians. So it's really ludicrous. And I think that there's a lot of quote unquote journalists that get caught up in this old Cold War paradigm of like it was us versus them. And it's very understandable why the global South during, the era of the Vietnam War, of colonialism, Algeria, anything, it's completely understandable why they had to turn to the Soviet bloc for help because there was nothing. The ANC wouldn't have been able to get training if they hadn't turned to the Soviet bloc. A lot of them were very dubious of communism. Nelson Mandela himself was very dubious of communism, but he naturally accepted help from the Soviets, as they would. But now it's a kind of a new world, and you don't really have blocks that are based on ideology. So I generally think that if people are being told, oh, it's this part of the world versus that part, I think that they're being fooled, would be the impression I have. I think we're kind of all in it together. I think Israelis are eventually going to deal with their shitty government the way Syrians dealt with their shitty government. And I think that I just don't really believe in like axes and all of that. I think that people should not be colonized and people should have the right to vote where they're born. And I don't think that it necessarily always applies to a greater philosophy. And that's the problem sometimes with intellectuals is that if you've been writing about white supremacy, which is a gigantic fucking problem in the US, you're going to want to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the perspective of it's an issue of white supremacy. But in some ways it's not because you have a diverse government, a diverse country, Israel, with our black people from all over the world, right? Oppressing a diverse population of Palestinians, that Palestinians are very diverse as well. And so it doesn't necessarily exactly fit into that paradigm. It's apartheid, but it's not necessarily apartheid by the same rules as it's always been elsewhere. In many ways, you could say it's similar to the way that Ethiopia treats the Tigray region or the way Sudan treats Darfur. It's colonialism, it's oppression, it's apartheid, but it's not necessarily part of it's not necessarily part of the grand structures that we saw before. It's just wrong.
In terms of Israel-Russia cooperation, you recommended a book to me that I'm familiar with, but I haven't read it all yet, and that's the Palestine Laboratory: How
Yes.
Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World by Anthony Lowenstein. Can you talk a little bit about that book and how it's influenced your reporting on all of this?
Yeah, so Anthony is a Jewish Australian writer and activist, and he writes a lot about the Palestinian issue. He writes a lot about how the canard of saying that it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. And a couple years ago, he was writing this book about the export of Israeli technology, and he contacted me because I'd written about the export of Israeli drone technology to Russia. And so I put him in touch with a few experts that helped explain that export. And it is true that the fact is that Israel has exported technology to U.S. enemies. Some surveillance technology that China has obtained has come from Israel. There's evidence that some of the computer programs that they've been using might have been exported. Pegasus software has been used by repressive regimes in the area. I think it's been used by the UAE, and it's very common that I think that naturally oppressive states are going to gravitate towards each other, even if they don't necessarily have like geopolitical alignment. It makes sense. A lot like look at Tulsi Gabbard. You know, she's an apologist for Netanyahu and Assad. It's perfect. She's exactly the kind of person that all those governments want in place.
So I have your article pulled up, and I don't know if there's any specific points you want to mention from it, but people can read it at the Intercept. How Israeli-designed drones became Russia's eyes in the sky for defending Bashar al-Assad. That's from July 16th, 2019. So you've been covering this for a while. Were there
Mm,
any key points from the Intercept piece that you think are really worth honing in on at this time?
yes. I think definitely the fact that there have been overt political exchanges between the two countries. So there's one really specific incident where the Netanyahu government requested that the Russians help find the corpse of an Israeli pilot who was shot down, I think at some point. And his body was buried in a Palestinian cemetery in Yarmouk. And at the request of the Russians, the regime dug up the cemetery, disturbed it, found the body, and then returned it to the Israelis. And it was a big like election boost for Netanyahu. There was a big transfer ceremony. The Russians claimed it as like, "Hey, look at us helping Israel." And of course, and interestingly enough, that it was to trade two prisoners who was in Israel was the exchange, and both of those prisoners requested not to be sent back to Syria. They wanted to be sent elsewhere. So it just, this geopolitical game that's just completely ignoring the people that are involved. I think that that poetically speaks volumes as to what is really happening.
A lot of people, when I mention the Russia Israel relationship, will say to me, "Well, that all changed after October 7th, and oh, look at Russia hosted Hamas." How do you respond to those people that want to say, "Well, there was a paradigm shift in
Mm.
since October 7th"?
I mean, there may have been because the what changes there is that two of Russia's allies, Iran and Israel, are super pissed. Like, so that obviously is going to make a paradigm shift. But is Russia going to ban Israeli defense companies from doing business with them? I doubt it. Is Israel going to impose the sanctions that the rest of the world has imposed on Russia? No. In rhetoric, sure, but in reality, is they're doing business, like it's like nothing has ever changed.
I can cut this out if you want because I don't think we talked about it beforehand. But I've been very interested in there's a lot of these like uh private Israeli intelligence agencies that have popped up in the past few years, and one of them that interested me was Psy Group. Have you heard of that?
No, is
It
it?
tied into the Mueller investigation, but it's just I'm wondering if you know anything about just private Israeli intelligence and how it connects to geopolitical geopolitics.
Yeah, I mean, ex-Israeli spies are considered very valuable as security advisors. So it exists in multiple governments. I'm sure would rely on those people. But I want to say that it's important to try to keep perspective on that because some people will look at that and they'll say, oh, it's Jews sticking their fingers into everything, and that's just not true. Every government does that shit. You know, it's just that
Israel is not necessarily exceptional.
it's not exceptional. It's the same shit. It's just that their policy is hyper racist. Like they're not even necessarily more capable, that much more capable than other people. It's just that their policy is insanely racist, and so they have this very advanced defense establishment in pursuit of a goal that's horrible. So it really sticks out, you know?
It's really interesting because, I mean, when you think about it, the whole relationship has been very paradoxical because at the very base of it, you basically have Israeli-designed drones uh, becoming Russia's, as you put it, eyes in the sky for defending Assad. I mean, it seems paradoxical, but that's really at base what happened.
I'll do you one better. This is what's even crazier is at some point, I think in 2018, the Israelis shot one of these things down. It veered too close to their airspace and they shot it down. And then there were pictures of it and it has all the markings on it and it's just blatantly Israeli manufactured weapon. So it's not it's paradoxical, but when you look at authoritarian governments, which I would consider Israel to be one, it's not that surprising. This kind of thing has been very common. I also wanted to point out a lot of Israel's defense satellites were launched by Russia.
Oh, really?
You know, oh, absolutely. They've been there was a big in the 2000s there was a big push for the Israelis to get like an independent defense satellites. And it was Russia that did a lot of that. And also, ironically, Elon Musk has a lot of contracts with the Israelis. And it's just the strangest thing in the world to see some people that claim to be pro-Palestinian like celebrating this guy.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely insane the amount of people I've seen
Yeah.
celebrating these figures.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
I want to go back to this because I initially pitched the show as being about those documents alleging collaboration
Mm.
between uh, Israel and Assad Syria. You said earlier they haven't been verified, but um, they're either done by someone with a tremendous amount of research to fake them, or they're authentic. What about them makes you think that they're potentially authentic or written by someone who's very familiar with faking these documents?
So my colleague Nizar Al-Rafai and I went through some of the messages that are in the documents, and then we matched them against known incidents of Israeli strikes, and they do match Israeli strikes, most of them that we can tell so far. We're going to have to go more in depth because it's really a lot of research involved, but it does seem that they are talking about known incidents. So whoever wrote it definitely was aware of the deconfliction line, was aware of some of these incidents. And the other thing that stands out about them is that they're really boring. Like it reveals a lot of information, but it doesn't, you would think that somebody that would try and fake something to maybe implicate the Assad regime as like a collaborator of Israel would probably make it a little bit more juicy, I guess. Because it doesn't there's nothing that's like, hey, go kill this guy for us. You know, it's like it's like we bombed this. Make sure you're not near it next time. Is like the kind of communication that it is. So the implication isn't necessarily that Assad helped the Israelis, but it's that he helped lead the Hezbollah people into a trap, essentially, by not warning his allies. That would be the implication of the documents. And but I have to say, I don't know. I don't know if they're real or not. It's also noteworthy that a person could fake them. It is possible because the most of the information in them is outward facing information, which means that you wouldn't need to be inside that deconfliction line to fake those documents. But then that raises the question, why would you fake something so dull?
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Uh, Iran has a lot of enemies. There's Al Arabiya is one of the outlets that released the documents, and it's Saudi. The Saudi government hates Iran, so that could be a motive. But that being said, again, the content is dull. Like they are boring, occasionally snippy conversations between bureaucrats in militaries, and it reads that way.
So to reiterate, these documents aren't saying like Assad, like it's more that he didn't share information with Axis of Resistance members,
Yeah,
or okay.
yes, but that's still, I mean, like that would be considered treasonous to any Like if the Ukrainians were like if the Ukrainians were letting the Russians bomb Polish volunteers, for example, right? Or letting them bomb the Georgian volunteers and saying, okay, we'll move our troops next time we do it. There'd be no question. It would be the end of the government there. It would be over because it would be considered treasonous.
I'm reading the New Arab on this, and it's saying that the documents expose that the regime was sharing intelligence with Israel and even facilitating military operations against Iranian militias. Is that correct, or is that overstating it?
I think that's essentially correct, but I think
Okay.
but they are doing that through passivity. Okay. Now, it's a kind of passivity that would be like if it was Nazi occupied Europe, you'd be considered a collaborator for doing this. Like if the Nazis told you, "Hey, we're going to raid a resistance outpost, in a day, please don't say anything or be there." Like it would be considered treasonous. So it is coordinating military activity somewhat, but it's not like the villainous scheming of like the Syrians aren't getting anything out of it except for they get to have troops support their fight, and then they don't have to deal with the Israelis because the Israelis are happy to just bomb them sometimes. Like it's
That's
just
the next thing I wanted to ask you about
yeah
was the common response I've had to this article is, well, what would Assad have gotten out of this passivity?
yeah being left alone. He'd get theoretically, and also there's a reference in the documents to we will allow you to do such and such to fill your needs, but don't allow Hezbollah to carry such and such weapons. And what that kind of indicates is that there was an understanding that the Assad regime could use these forces to try and maintain their grip on power, which was preferable to the Israelis, but not to allow them to launch attacks on Israel or to be armed with certain weapons that could be transferred to Lebanon. And the fact is that if you look at the history of it, I can't think of any Hezbollah attacks on Israel from Syria, and they were at some point basically the predominant military force there.
In terms of, since I want to tie this all together for listeners in case because I think these topics can get confusing. How would you connect these leaked documents, which again, I keep reiterating, they have not yet been verified. We'll see how that pans out. I still think it's an important story because,
Mhm.
I think it's plausible that these are real documents. How does this connect to what you've been doing with Israel and Russia? I know you're probably going to be reiterating some points you made earlier, but I really want to hammer
Mhm.
this point home of how these two issues are connected.
Oh, they're directly connected because if these are real, they are the communications of the deconfliction line, 100%. If they're fake, there's someone trying to fake the communications of the deconfliction line. And the term Russian mechanism that's used in those documents is a reference to the deconfliction line.
Just a few more things if you have the time.
I've got all the time, yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about you sent me some clips of things you filmed during the first Battle of Aleppo.
Hmm.
I know this is veering off from the original topic, but what were your experiences like filming that
Yeah.
and
Like the past few weeks have been really overwhelming. Like I'm starting to really understand the post part of post-traumatic stress disorder because it's just like in the back of my mind for years. I started going to Syria in 2012, short trip, and then in 2013 I went back. 2014 I went back, 2015, and then I went to northeast Syria in 2018. So I've done several trips, mostly Aleppo province, and then once in the northeast, and it's just it's overwhelming. Like the seeing Aleppo with my own eyes, it was like how people describe Hiroshima or Dresden or Warsaw. It was just the complete destruction of a city and you as soon as even as early as 2012 you kind of soon discovered that East Aleppo lived in the camps. Like a lot of these cities that were liberated, the regime bombed them so intensely that people had to flee out of the camps. So one of the arguments that a lot of Assad regime supporters would make is that when these cities would fall, they say, oh, they're basically empty. Everyone's really on our side. Nobody supported these rebels. And the fact is that those people weren't not there, is that they were in the camps in the north. They were in like Azaz and this constellation of camps in Turkey. And we're seeing right now that Aleppo is liberated, people are rushing back. And so it's obvious that what you were seeing was the destruction of a country. And God, what else? Yeah, and just seeing the blatant nature of the targeting of civilians was just unbelievable to see. And I remember at some point just sitting on a porch in East Aleppo. I think it was 2013, and I was just watching like an L-39 jet just like fly through the clouds, like back and forth. And it was just wild because they had free reign of the air, and you could just see them up there. They're not going to be able to hit a military target. They're searching for a big civilian target, and it just being able to see them with your own eyes. It was just crazy. Like they're out to kill us, and they're out to kill their own people, and it's blatant. It's so weird. Like I never would be able to look at planes the same way again ever after that. And and actually a friend of mine who died, Raed Fares, he came to visit the United States, and his friends used to say that whenever there was a plane going by, that it was just the strangest thing for him to see because he'd already,
He's
I
already
guess
seen them as like death
just
machines, basically.
they're the enemy, like it's just it never fully goes away. And it's just really strange to see. I've always loved airplanes and I love technology, and I think that it should always be, used for peaceful purposes. And so the way that air power is used to like kill has always been something that's motivated me as a journalist, because I'd really like to see all this fancy stuff that we have as a species be used for something really cool. I love it when airplanes do acrobatics. I love it when we explore space. I think that stuff's fantastic. I love NASA. I just don't want it to be I don't want NASA to be like an auxiliary for the killing machine, and that is something that really makes me very sad, that with all this technology we have, we're using it towards like this shit, like we're using it towards regimes that it can't even kill their enemies and just massacre civilians. So yeah, just it was completely apocalyptic. I was there in 2013 when Nusra, now HTS, started taking over buildings and kidnapping people and targeting some of the other groups. And it was an entirely different group back then. Like these were hostile, scary ass people. And I'm really glad that their fighters obviously have learned a lot of discipline. I'm glad that it's obvious that exile Syrians and Syrians of other sects have intervened to say, listen, you can't do this yourself. You're going to have to accept that this is a pluralistic country. I think that's a large part of it, but I can tell you, having been there in 2013, that they were, Al Qaeda is as Al Qaeda does. Like they were exactly what they preached to be, and there was no ambiguity about their extremism or their origins or anything whatsoever. That being said, people do change. I'm different in my 40s than I was in my 20s and 30s,
Right.
and
For me, I don't know what to think of what's going to happen in Syria. I guess
Mhm.
my view is we really will have to wait and see. I don't agree with people saying there are no concerns about HTS. I also don't agree with the people that say, oh, HTS couldn't have changed over the years. Jelani couldn't have changed. I just think that there's uncertainty right now. That's my view, but
Yeah, I take the same view, but I do also think that actions matter, and some things have happened that like it's almost too powerful. Syrians are amazing trolls, right? Because a lot of them have been in exile and powerless for years. So they know how to hurt their oppressors with thought, you know, with like ideas. And I think that in a way, like these big celebrations you're seeing with like unveiled women dancing with jihadists in the streets, and like the Christian people just like going nuts and celebrating at their churches. I think in a way, like the power of that is the ultimate troll against the regime and the Russians. Like that has momentum to it that I think people are grabbing, and I hope that it continues. Right now, my biggest, interestingly enough, like as of today, the biggest threat to peace in Syria, without a doubt, is Turkey. Like as of today, because there's momentum on there being some kind of negotiation between the SDF and HTS. There's very much like the possibility that they could form a coalition, and that it would be that would be more democratic. That would be a very positive step in my opinion. But the spoiler right now is Turkey, who are just absolutely committed to harming the Kurds, that they really did nothing against Assad. Like a lot of opposition Syrians seem to trust them. I think that's wrong. I think that they've been cynically playing the same kind of game that Russia and Israel were playing. To them, it's always about their own interests. And right now, there's a threat that they'll invade Kobane, which was the city that resisted ISIS. And when Kobane resisted ISIS, it wasn't just Kurdish people that were fighting. The Free Syrian Army sent fighters to fight with them. And the FSA and, well, certain groups of it and the YPG fought alongside each other against ISIS. And now you have a situation where Turkey is threatening to invade Kobane, ethnically cleanse it. And so it's interesting that sort of the most deadly, dangerous threat to Syrians got on a plane and left for Moscow. But the second most deadly is now the most deadly. It's now the big problem is Turkey. And that to me is a terrifying prospect because
No,
there's so
I
much.
agree. I'm very worried about Turkey,
Mhm.
both Turkey and Israel's involvement in
Yes.
um, Syria right now have me very concerned. I think both of these governments, I think Erdogan has sort of expansionist ambitions, I'll put it that way. And I think Netanyahu's political survival depends on giving the most far-right Smotrich Ben-Gvir types what they want, which seems to be a greater Israel project. And that is going to be a recipe for just chaos. And what bothers me is I think the Syrian people are caught in the middle of it. Just these different factions that have their own interests at heart and not the Syrian people.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Although I do have to say one thing. When it comes to the Greater Israel Project, I think it's a bit of a misnomer
Okay,
because
okay.
yeah, but just because I think what they want is to dominate the region. You know, I don't think they really care about the territory that's beyond like a buffer zone in Syria or that's beyond the West Bank. Like I think that they're plenty imperialist and they're plenty aggressive to other countries without there being a specific project. It's kind of like how the most extreme people in Turkey would like all Turkic nations to be part of one greater nation, right? So, Xinjiang province in China, East Turkestan, they're heavily involved in Azerbaijan. They Extremists in Turkey have this idea of a greater Turkey, right? But realistically, even though Erdogan is a shithead who's influenced by that, if you were to say like the Greater Turkey Project, it's not going to happen. Like it's just not a real thing. It's part of their mentality, but it's not really going to happen. And I think the same thing with the Greater Israel Project. I think is really just, I'm sure it's something that people have thrown around and that some people have that mentality, but really what they want to do is oppress the shit out of the Palestinians and invade as far as they need to be allowed to oppress the shit out of to oppress the shit out of the Palestinians. I think that that's basically like we don't need to imagine what they want to do. They're doing it.
Before we close out,
Mm.
and again, I just want to delve into this because I think part of the problem with the way uh, s- various people on the left or just in general talk about Syria, no, it's not just the left, but I think there's this issue of it's a Cold War sort of thinking that
Yes.
goes back to arguments about campism. There's
Hmm.
the first camp and the second camp. You're either a pro-US campus or a anti-US campus.
Yes.
And I don't think that's the proper way to look at any of this because I think US policy in the Middle East has been pretty terrible over the decades. I also don't know that any of the other players in the region have the interests of, the populations in those countries at heart either.
Yeah.
They're interested in their own national interests. So I feel
Yep.
like either this pro-US campism or anti-US campism doesn't really get at the heart of the issue.
Completely. And also, it's just about what's fair. Like at the end of the day, it's about what's fair. For example, like Lebanon is a sovereign country, right? Lebanon should have the right to control its own airspace, its own territory. It should have the right to have its own state. But American policy towards Lebanon is basically to keep it weak, to make it easier for Israel to invade, right? Israel's policy is to have this thing called qualitative edge, is they believe that they have the right, by any means necessary, to have the best technology of a military in the world, And that's even at the expense of doing something like messing with US allies or messing with countries that aren't hostile. Like they don't want Jordan to have very good technology. They don't want Egypt, which is just blatantly a collaborator with Israel, to have certain types of technology. So we're willing to, for something that's really stupid, like them, like the Israeli government believing that they have the right to have the best technology in the world, we're willing to take these very cynical positions. And I don't think that's pro or anti-US. I think any country that's doing business with Israel is going to be like, cool, whichever makes us more money, we're going to go with. And it's not. So that's why I have a very unconspiratorial view of the world. I think the like the problem with the
I
world
mean,
is
in
obviously,
some ways, really, if I could interject, I think it's not just an unconspiratorial
yeah.
worldview. I think people need a worldview that doesn't try to reduce geopolitics to it's the good guys on this side versus the bad guys is probably, the best way to go. I mean, we're
Yeah.
dealing with something that isn't about good guys and bad guys necessarily.
And like as a socialist, I'm obviously prejudiced on this one, but it's like you know that the fucking problem is capitalism. Like you know it. Like it's the same problem that's going on in China with Xinjiang. Like why is it that we can't challenge this? Because they make our products. It's not pro or anti anything. That it's not pro West or anti West that American companies are complicit with the cultural genocide against Uyghurs in China. It's not because they like communism or hate communism. It's because it's the bottom line. It's because they love capitalism that they're willing to overlook this kind of stuff. And you see it everywhere. And I think that it's not I think that the campism, there's an element of it like being real. There's obviously like a pro-US camp and an anti-US camp, but at the end of the day, you have to look at the actions of individual states and how they treat their own people. And I just don't understand why anybody would I don't understand why anybody would be unwilling to look at Israeli crimes because of Iran's crimes or unwilling to look at Iran's crimes because of Israel's. It's not good. It's not logical. It's not critical thinking.
I was going to say, in a lot of ways, it's the geopolitical version of like lesser of two evilism. And
Hmm.
sometimes I just think that's not, I get why people engage in lesser of two evils at times, but I don't think we should allow ourselves to be dishonest about what is happening in the
Yeah,
world, so.
exactly. And the fact is that nobody's great. Like I don't like it when people will use the argument, oh, Hamas are terrorists. Okay, fine, yeah, they're terrorists. Who gives a shit? That doesn't mean that you can kill 50,000 people. Like we'd almost be well served to not like fall into those traps. Like a lot of people are saying, oh, Nusra was Al Qaeda. Yeah, they were. Okay, like we're still in the situation that we're in now, and and there's just I don't know, like maybe you have to like have a look. You have to know what you want as opposed to like what you don't want. And I think that a lot of the time we just don't really like we're not willing to see a future. We're willing to only focus on the way things were in the past.
Well, I'm sure we'll both get flack for some of the things we've said. We'll
Hey,
piss
man, that's
off
the
people
truth.
on all sides of this, which probably means we're doing something right. But I want to thank you again. I have another interview coming up, but in closing, what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation?
I hope they get the perspective of somebody that was in Syria during these crucial battles, the perspective of somebody that was with the White Helmets in Aleppo and saw their work when they were. I didn't see them rescue people because you can't always embed at the exact moment that a bomb drops. But I saw them doing the very hard humanitarian work of cleaning up, of helping dig wells, of repairing the infrastructure. They showed me a lot of the bomb damage that had been done to their homes. So you've just had an interview with somebody that was on the ground with these people that got a chance to see what they're like. uh, I'm somebody that the whole time that I've been involved with Syria have always felt that people there are much more secular than the media will tell you. And I think that it's important to take away that the idea that the idea that any bloc in the world is fighting some grand fight to like save anything out. Like the Iranian bloc isn't doing shit, the Israeli bloc isn't doing shit, the American bloc isn't doing shit,
Did
and the
you
Russian
did you
bloc isn't
happen to
doing shit.
see not to interrupt you, but did you
No,
happen to see the historian Rashid Halidi, who's been very involved in the Palestinian cause? He came out and said, you know, well, Iran isn't, doing everything it can just for Palestinians. It does things based on its own interests. It's
Yeah,
not, yeah.
he's great. Yeah, his perspective is highly educated. His work on Palestine is excellent scholarship. I think he's always been somebody that's really rejected the. He's always rejected people. Like he's been a prominent voice in pointing out that Zionism is different from Judaism, and it's been more than just saying those words. Like he's really helped people see that as a fact. And so I think that his take is correct. And the fact is that like Syria did invade Lebanon in the 1970s to support the Phalangists who were killing the PLO. They did create a faction in the 1980s called Fatah al-Intifada to try and take out the PLO. And they did create a faction called the PFLP-GC to try and take out the PFLP. So they've been very active in subverting the Palestinian cause and trying to get people to work as mercenaries for them, essentially. And so, and again, there's been this controversy of the new government has said that they want to disarm some of the Palestinian groups. They're not saying that they want to end, Palestinian movement. What they're talking about is specific groups that were hired to kidnap people in the refugee camps. And I think that a lot of, if you look at everything as, oh, it's part of some new Cold War, everything is part of a different axis, you could easily say, oh, these guys carry the Palestinian flag, so what they fight for is Palestine. But the fact is that a lot of these groups were just kidnapping Palestinians for the Assad regime. And
Well, yeah, and for me, the important thing about what Halidi is saying is, a group can say they support Palestinians when really they're voicing support out of their own interests, and they're not necessarily 100% like, oh, everything is ideologically about defending the oppressed people. Yeah.
oh yeah. And also, if you look at a lot of commentary from Hezbollah supporters right now, it's fucking nuts. Like one of the funniest things I saw online was someone saying, "Oh, the Palestinians were the real Jews all along." Like it's just this, like it's this anti-Semitism and like this extremism that's just like directed in like just the most nonsensical directions. And it's you hate the Palestinians now, like what the hell? Like it's just very with the fall of the Assad regime, I would ask people to try and pay attention to what his supporters are saying now and who they're blaming and how willing they are to sell out the stuff that they claim to stand for.
Well, I want to thank you again, Patrick Hilsman. We'll have to do this again maybe after the holidays because I want to get
I
deeper
would love
insights
to.
into your experiences in Syria. But thank you
Yeah.
again, and how can my listeners keep up with you?
Yeah, just Twitter, Patrick Hilsman. And also just I've been writing for the Intercept lately. I'll probably have another piece soon.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Patrick Hilsman. As always, if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.